Life is difficult. Have you read M. Scott, I think it's M. Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled? Anyway, it's the very first line in that book. And he just starts right out in the beginning, life is difficult. And the Buddha's first teaching was the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is life is difficult. In so many words, life is unsatisfactory by definition. I think that these teachings came about 2,500 years ago shows that human life has been difficult for a long time. This isn't just a new modern challenge. But I will say that it does seem, and there have been different challenges over time. So, now we have food that it's abundant, at least here in the Americas. Comfort is abundant, more than it probably has ever been. But we have new difficulties, new challenges, and I think it's very confusing to be a human being on our planet right now. There are so many pressures to be a certain way, to develop as a certain kind of person, especially in our culture in the U.S. To be fit and thin and beautiful, to be successful in whatever you do, to, if you grow up in a middle-class family, to not sink below that, or if you grow up in whatever socioeconomic status is, to move to the next one, to be famous, to be respected, to be admired, to have education and degrees, to have families where your kids are also all of those things, to have a romantic relationship that continues to be sexually interesting and intimate all the way until the end. There's so many goals that we can get ourselves involved in that are just given to us. That's part of our culture. So no matter which culture you or we are born into, whether it be an American culture, Ecuadorian culture, South African culture, Italian culture, that culture is going to hand us or you, whoever is growing up in that culture, it's going to hand all the goals that you're supposed to be chasing after. And we buy it hook, line, and sinker. We just buy right into it. We don't know what to do different. From the beginning, human beings have been seeking happiness, satisfactoriness, contentment, these kinds of things. And depending on the culture that we are born into, that culture tells us how we are going to find those things. So all those things that I mentioned already, that's what our culture tells us, that that's where we're going to find it. But then you read something like the Tao Te Ching, written by Lao Tzu a little over 2,500 years ago, and it's the complete opposite of everything that our culture tells us. And then you read the Dhammapada, the words of the Buddha. You read the Christian mystics, Meister Eckhart, the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the Sufis, Native Americans, and all these people say pretty much the exact opposite of what our American culture tells us where we're going to find happiness. So here we are as spiritual beings You know, I believe ultimately that we are spiritual beings. And yet we're drawn into seeking happiness outside of us through chasing accomplishments and getting hits of self-esteem over and over and over and over and over again, thinking that one day we'll get enough of it, or it will be the ultimate achievement that will give us everlasting self-esteem pleasures. But it's a bottomless bowl of self-esteem. In our youth, if we have enough privilege, there's so many wonderful things to do. To travel, to play music, to be in relationships, to sing and dance and see the world. It's so wonderful. I lived in a van for 10 years and traveled around rock climbing and went to dance clubs in all the major cities and met really interesting people and read all kinds of wonderful books and did all these kinds of things, but ultimately none of them led me to peace. They led me to joy. I definitely had joy. I definitely had adventure and fun. I definitely learned things about myself and the world and people around me, but none of it led to lasting peace. But I had to do those things. I had to exhaust that to see for myself that they were empty, that they were ultimately empty. I'm 45, and in the last 2 years, I finally let go of having a thin belly where you could see the six-pack. I was an athlete for most of my adult life, my youth and my adult life. And it was a real process to look in the mirror and see this fat little belly that had never been there before. It scared me, it was frightening, it was sad. There was a loss of my youth. A loss of sexiness. I used to have long hair. I've had dreadlocks a couple times. I used to have really tan skin, and I was a Yosemite guy living in Yosemite, walking around barefoot and shirtless and muscular and tan and all of that. Yeah, a loss of beauty, a loss of youth. And hope, a loss of hope. A loss of dreams and fantasies. What I've learned about karma, so karma is this word that I've come to really, really love. It points at something so important about on our spiritual paths. And karma can be looked at from a variety of different ways, but this week, just this week, I mean, I've looked at it this way before, but this week specifically, I'm looking at karma as agendas, to-do lists. And like I said before, we're born with a set of to-do lists. And if you're a privileged person, I grew up in the middle class, which is there's plenty of privilege in that, and white, male, able-bodied, English as my primary language, or my first language. So a lot of privilege there. And this to-do list was already there. Finish high school, go to college, graduate school was kind of like on the edge of my to-do lists. No one in my family had gone to graduate school, but I'm a smart person, so some part of me was like, well, that should be on my to-do list. Adventure, travel the world, all those things that I was talking about. And it's almost like until I checked those boxes, I wasn't ready to settle down and look inside. Because there was plenty of adventurous and interesting and exciting things outside of me that could give me really wonderful feelings. So that's what I did for a while. And actually I was going to say until it stopped doing that, but it still does that. I'm still hooked. So a little bit about what I'm trying to talk about here is that each one of us in this room has a set of agendas, a set of check boxes, a to-do list that is conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. So there are unconscious agendas that drive all the activities that we do each day. And those could be self-esteem driven, they could be a need to finish something from our childhood. So if we didn't get a certain kind of love in our childhood, then we're probably going to be seeking that out in our adulthood. If we didn't get seen by our parents, then we're going to be seeking to get seen in our adulthood, probably, to fix that in our psyche. So that's the unconscious. And then there's the subconscious, and that's what we have a little bit of access to. So memories, for example, are in the subconscious. So they're not just readily available, but if we kind of pause for a second and look around inside, then we can access certain memories. So that's the subconscious. So there's certain agendas that we kind of have some awareness about, but it's not really right up there on the table in front of us. And these are patterns that we get into over and over again, that we have this sort of like, oh, maybe I should look at that, but then we don't. And then we just do these things in cycles. We just keep doing the same pattern of behavior over and over and over again because we're not looking at it. And then there's the ones that are conscious. And we can't beat our karma, but we can watch it. We can become aware of it. We can notice it. We can appreciate it, love it, have compassion for ourselves and the karma itself. But if we don't look at it, then it keeps doing what it keeps doing. And so those things that are right in front of us, oh yeah, we have to put our full attention to that and really feel. Because our karma are feelings. Externally it turns into behaviors, pattern behaviors, but internally they're feelings. It's anxiety, it's guilt, it's shame, hurt, sadness, grief, anger, powerlessness, that emptiness, not the spiritual emptiness, but that sort of psychological void, or that psychological emptiness, a loneliness. Those are the feelings that are so uncomfortable in our bodies, that then drive all of our patterned behaviors that keep us from seeing, experiencing, and manifesting, living our true self, or our true nature, our Buddha nature. From the teachings on Buddhism, we are already Buddhas. As we are, with all of our pattern behaviors and our karma, all of that, it's already perfect. From a certain perspective, from the absolute perspective, there's no problem at all. We are okay, just as we are. This world is okay, just as it is, with all of its issues. Yet, there's pain and there's suffering. But we add this extra layer of suffering. So we feel pain, but then we also add this extra layer of suffering, which is wishing that we weren't feeling that pain and wanting to be something that we are not. The to-do list, the checklist, is usually about creating a self that is not who we are naturally. And that is a source of our suffering, or maybe the source of our suffering is clinging to this longed for ideal of who we want to be, or who we think we should be, which some of it is conscious, some of it is subconscious, and some of it's unconscious.